So welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 12th, 2024, and today we are going to be taking a look at our national and statewide polling averages and the partisan lean of pollsters that have been conducting a variety of different question surveys across the past 2 weeks that have skewed our averages in quite a tremendous way in favor of former President Donald Trump. On your screen right now is a tweet from Adam Carlson, who does a lot of different polling aggregates and generally just tracks what the data, what data we're seeing, and gives us a bit more commentary than what you might see on something like Real Clear Politics or 538. And he mentions here how since September 30th, which is, at the time, last Monday, currently still very relevant, just 12 days since then, there have been almost as many Republican-aligned pollsters that have done and conducted polls, put out there, used for analysis, all these different things, as much as nonpartisan polls. The Republican-aligned polls and the nonpartisan polls are roughly even with each other, with Democratic-aligned polls basically non-existent. And what he's done here is specifically track the number of publicly released presidential election swing state polls. These were conducted since September 30th. When you take a look at the date at which this was tweeted out, it was tweeted out yesterday, so talking about a pretty quick turnaround when it comes down to it. But looking at it, since September 30th, we have seen a number of Republican-aligned polls totaling up to 26 swing state polls conducted by GOP firms. 33 nonpartisan polls conducted across the swing states. And in terms of the Democrats, they have just one. And a big reason why this matters is because when we take a look at averages, like the ones people talk about on Real Clear Politics, it's very easy to see how, in some people's minds, you might be looking at it from the perspective that all of these averages have shifted away from Kamala Harris. This is the Biden versus Trump numbers. But when it comes down to the Trump versus Harris numbers, you might have noticed the national numbers don't seem to be changing too much. But on the statewide level in the Electoral College, we've seen turnarounds. For instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, Real Clear Politics now has Kamala Harris losing. In the state of Wisconsin, or Michigan even. Wisconsin's an example we'll show at the end, but Michigan's a better example. Kamala Harris never lost when it came down to the averages in the state of Michigan during the duration of her candidacy, except for in the first week. Now, all of a sudden, she's losing in the state of Michigan. Granted, some of these numbers here aren't phenomenal for the Democratic Party, but it doesn't mean that they're losing on average. A big reason for that, when you take a look and cross-reference at some of these Republican polls, you start to see exactly why this matters. And just looking at the Republican polls conducted, again, back to that point, what we're seeing in the state of Michigan is largely what we're seeing here. Insider advantage, right up there. What do you find in the most recent Michigan poll? Insider advantage. When you're taking a look at other groups, Trafalgar is up here. What do you notice on the average here? Trafalgar conducts one as well. You're seeing, again, back and forth. You can see comparisons being made. In Michigan in specific, 4 of these recent polls were conducted by Republican firms. You have places like Trafalgar that are skewing this average. You have places like Insider Advantage that are skewing this average. And when we take a more specific look, let's see if we can go ahead and just match these up here, because it really is quite interesting if you ask me. Overall, a number of these conducted polls that have been done since September 30th, a lot of them being Republican firms, you're going to find the averages do eventually skew. And it again has translated to all of these polls being done in all of the battleground states. Kamala Harris now holds, no advantages in the no toss-ups map with the exception of the state of Wisconsin, which even then, again, those Republican pollsters, Insider Advantage being the most recent, Trafalgar also conducting one as well, the average narrowing down as well. Back to that map, though, again, Donald Trump takes the advantage. But when you take a look at more reputable sites, even ones that do include some of these Republican firms that weight them a bit further down because of their inaccuracies or their intentional omissions of likely voter screens in key and crucial areas in battleground states like Pennsylvania, you start to see that the numbers don't align perfectly across these maps. Wisconsin still has Kamala Harris ahead at 538, so does Real Clear Politics. But you know what 538 also shows is that Kamala Harris leads in Michigan, that Kamala Harris leads in Pennsylvania, that in the state of Nevada, Kamala Harris holds an advantage. And on the national level, relatively no change to that of the beginning on September 30th when Kamala Harris held an advantage of 2.8. Today she holds an advantage of 2.5. And I really do take problem with the fact that these Republican-aligned polls are really being produced at such a high rate. These publicly released numbers are being produced and put out there in a way we just simply don't see Democrats really following through on. Almost all of these polls that we have seen have largely been nonpartisan. And this could be because a lot of Democrats don't release internal data. They don't release a lot of these Democratic-aligned polls if the results aren't as favorable as they might like. But equally, too, a lot of them just aren't being conducted or publicly released at the same way. We remember a lot of that data back in 2020 that the Biden team held informed their decisions to move into states like Georgia, and move into states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and continuing to put out the money there, continuing to focus on those states despite having an excess of money. And none of those polls ever made it to the publicly released area until they were discussed years after the presidential election, months after we saw some rumblings about what the polls were telling us, and then the autopsy and dissecting, why the Trump campaign failed, and then also just looking back at what people who were close to President Biden had said was the reason for why they went about the campaign strategy the way they did. You were really seeing the Democratic Party in full force back then. And a lot of those numbers, again, didn't skew the average because Democrats weren't releasing them, even though they were leading in those polls. And it isn't just contained, right, to polls when it comes down to this Republican skew that we've seen as of late. Elon Musk recently tweeted out, big fan of Donald Trump, Elon Musk, tweeted out about Polymarket. In his tweet, he said, "This is the most accurate predictor for an election." And a big reason why he tweeted it out was because the Polymarket averages were going back and forth between Trump and Harris, back and forth between, him leading, Kamala Harris leading, and overall Elon Musk wanted to put his weight on the scale. And so what he decided to do was he tweeted it out. He said, "This is the most accurate site. Whoever's leading here will win the election." And what happens is there's a flood of the amount of people investing in this poly market, the amount of people focusing on this market, looking at it and investing in it, and it boosted up the amount of people that were looking at this race. And what happened is this was the time Elon Musk decided to tweet it out. We can see this article was written October 7th. Let's even use that as a reference point, even though it was written the day after he decided to tweet it out. Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, 2.5% difference, 6% difference, Donald Trump in the advantage. Today, he holds a 10-point advantage. What has changed besides the fact that Republican pollsters have come out and said Donald Trump leads? Not much. Nothing else has changed. She's still outpacing him on fundraising. She's still leading him on the national average. And according to 538, the numbers really haven't changed too tremendously since October 7th. You can see that when looking at some of these numbers. For instance, Nevada, October 7th, Kamala Harris led by 1. Today, she leads by 0.5. Sure, a shift, but nothing super significant. You're looking at Wisconsin, a bit of a narrowing down, but it's not enough to say that it should be shifting to what was a 2-point advantage for Trump to 10 points. None of this really makes that much sense. And again, we have to keep in mind that a lot of these recent data points are funded by Donald Trump. You can see a good example looking at these Republican-aligned firms: Fabrizio McLaughlin, Trafalgar, American Greatness, TIPP, SoCal, Arc Insights, all of these different groups that are funding and funding and funding and polling and polling and polling. And you're seeing in some of these states, Fabrizio Lee and Associates, Donald Trump was the direct sponsor here. That's the most recent poll we have. Emerson College on their own right said Harris led by 1. But what are you finding? Fabrizio Lee and Associates, what do they say? Donald Trump is ahead by 3. Really is quite interesting, right? On message, Donald Trump leads by 2. You can see it in the other battleground states. Insider Advantage has it even. Fabrizio Lee and Associates has Trump up by 1. And sure, Emerson can agree with them. But when you have different versions of the poll being conducted in a number of battleground states, all pushing for this idea that it's narrowing up in a dramatic way, it really does damage to the validity of an average, especially when Democrats aren't doing the same thing. And so I really am going to be really interested to see what our nonpartisan polls say about the current state of the race. That's why I really do think 538 provides a bit of an additional level of understanding that the complexities of polls and the historical accuracy and the weights and all of these different things, because the Republican polls, at the end of the day, are commissioned by campaigns to find numbers that look good for them. When Donald Trump is going into a state and looking for a number, obviously they would like to know where they are, but they have other pollsters to do that never end up seeing the light of day. But these more fluffy ones are there to show donors that Donald Trump is leading. In desperate times, you find that internal polls can sometimes show races that will largely be determined by 10, 20 points to be competitive. We've seen it happen time and time again in congressional races where there are grifter candidates who commission a poll, clearly looking for some type of response. And you will find polling firms that do things that are unorthodox. You do things that are unconventional. And what they decide to do is they decide to go ahead and poll different groups and demographics and find the results they want rather than find results. They find the results they want, and that's the same thing a lot of these Republican pollsters are doing. The only problem here is that major sites that used to hold a much higher standard in terms of reputation, like Rookler Politics, throw it into this average, completely negating any substantive polls being conducted by very real sources. And now, don't get me wrong. This election is absolutely close, but it doesn't help when the data we're working with is largely skewed towards the right intentionally by many of these pollsters, largely skewed in favor of the former president in a way we don't see Democrats doing the same exact thing. That stands to be a problem for understanding this election. And when we take a look at genuinely how close it is, I want you to just visually look at the New York Times numbers here. Nevada, less than a point. Michigan, less than a point. North Carolina, less than a point. Georgia, less than a point. Wisconsin, less than a point. Pennsylvania, a point. These states are so incredibly competitive and are truly well within toss-up territory. None of the battleground states, unlike 2020, are in territory that we can say it would take an outside margin of error, outside of average margin of error in these states for the polls to be wrong. It could take just a shift of less than a point in 5 states, and North Carolina and Georgia would be blue, but the Rust Belt would be red. It would be a crazy scenario. But that's the state of the polls and where they are today. But I can't help but think, are some of these numbers pushed out this way because Democrats don't have a competing wing of internal pollsters that are willing to release their numbers publicly? Is it because Democrats don't have this competing wing of, very much pushed and targeted questioning and overall just wrong levels of polls that have been done that have shown historical inaccuracies, historical bias that really do question the legitimacy of many of these firms? Places like Trafalgar that said Washington State would be decided by 3 points for it to go on to be a 14, 15-point race. For states like Trafalgar that said the state of Michigan was within a point, ended up being an 11-point margin of victory for the Democrats. States like polls like Trafalgar that showed Dr. Oz winning in Pennsylvania, and John Fetterman ended up winning by 5, and an accuracy of over 6 points. The numbers we see from a lot of these Republican pollsters do not stand to be some of the most accurate. Trafalgar loves to wave that flag that in 2020 they got many states correctly, but what they decided to say essentially was Trump was going to win it all. And by saying Trump was going to win it all, they were bound to get some states right, but they were by no means the most accurate, and in 2022 they fell out of total relevancy due to their heavy levels of inaccuracy. Now in 2024 they're back, and Real Clear Politics is eager to throw them back into the average. Donald Trump is not on track today to win an election with 302 electoral votes, but the election is absolutely close, and that's something you can't ignore. I just want to acknowledge that a lot of what we're seeing, not only here, but also in places like Polymarket, a lot of this is skewed by the networks that are pushing into it, by the people who are involved in the betting markets, by the people who are advertising and getting the word out. These are the ways that some of the traditional, more, accurate forms of understanding elections can get skewed by right-wing actors, left-wing actors, by partisan actors that do it with intentionality to benefit their candidate in terms of vibes, make their candidate seem more electable rather than be more electable, find better polls for their candidates rather than winning better at the polls. It's all about a game here that has resulted time and time again at boosting an agenda, boosting a candidate, and in this situation, it's all about boosting the candidacy of Donald Trump. Him going out there and saying, Elon Musk saying, Polymarket is more accurate than polls as actual money is on the line, and then all of a sudden Donald Trump surges. That is what you see changed in markets like these. You see it clear as day, and that's the exact reason why these Republican-aligned polls do skew the averages, do change the way we look at races, do gauge accuracy or not, do things that are wrong in terms of understanding this election process. And so the nonpartisan polls will be very interesting to watch. I still think the nonpartisan polls are going to be quite accurate. I also think, too, sometimes partisan polls can be accurate. But does that mean they are on the overall net? Certainly not more than the nonpartisan polls. And you have to acknowledge, of the recent polls that are used in these averages, that are contributing to this Democratic panic, contributing to this idea that Democrats are in a position where they no longer are on track to win the election, a lot of that is misguided. A lot of it is misguided by data points that simply should not be receiving the same amount of media attention that it actually is. All in all, though, Donald Trump can win this election, and so can Kamala Harris. This election is going to be really down to the wire. It really doesn't even matter what happens between now and Election Day because nothing really is going to change. We're in for the next 3 weeks of this race is still close. This race is still close. This race is still close, and that's just how it's going to be. Because at the end of the day, that's the nature of the American electoral system and the nature of the 2024 presidential election. And I don't really think it's that shocking that when you have a number of Republican-aligned polls that are skewing the averages in favor of Donald Trump, the narrative starts to form that Donald Trump starts to expand. But when you're looking at the nonpartisan data, Looking at the averages, not much has shifted more than a point over the past 2 weeks, and yet the entirety of the Democratic Party has panicked, despite this race still being exactly what we knew it was going to be, and that is close and competitive. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already. And check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.